Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Wednesday, May the 20th. After days of chaos, Rachel Reeves is going to kick the tyres and find out whether the machinery of government is still working today with a big and tricky growth announcement. What is it and what will it tell us about the state of the government right now? My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. PMQs at lunchtime, no doubt featuring the Prime Minister's future again, and a sense that real-world politics has been on hold for almost a fortnight since the local elections drama, but with the Straits of Hormuz still closed and ministers trying to figure out what to do about the consequences, we've got a couple of days of Treasury-powered announcements designed to help the country through that. But if ministers pull the levers, do they still work?
Yeah, I keep hearing that bits of Whitehall aren't working. And, that's compounded by mixed signals, should we say, from the centre. There are some in Downing Street, don't think there's much of a future worth planning for after June the 18th and the Makerfield by-election, but other people strongly disagree. And you can see disagreements over the Prime Minister's potential longevity in office splashed over the papers. Labour MPs, well, their focus is what Andy Burnham might do, perhaps understandably, but particularly because there'll be a lot of them are concerned for what it means for jobs. But there are still ministers in their roles, and some of them, like Rachel Reeves, interestingly, have tried to just try and get things done and start new things, which actually feels kind of quite bold at the moment.
Tomorrow, we're likely to hear from Reeves about fuel duty and the extent to which the rises due from September are going to come into force, or whether there is some relief on that. Today, there are signs that ministers are thinking of trying to strike a grand bargain with supermarkets over the prices of essential goods in return for lower regulation in other areas.
Yeah, all of this adds up to, I think, a real concern at the top of government over the ongoing consequences of what's going on in Iran, which we've talked about a lot less recently for understandable reasons, really, since the local elections. And I happened to grab a government minister last night who'd been looking at all of this, and they were, frankly, Anne, just quite downbeat. Partly because of just how hard it's turned out to plan over the consequences. So they acknowledge that basically Donald Trump isn't in control of events, and you can see that, quite plainly. Could there have been more bombing in the last few days? Maybe not. Is there a viable peace deal on the horizon? Maybe not. You just cannot begin to plan in a way that I don't remember it being true for any other global event. But also the sort of economic consequences have not played out as the early predictions suggested. So fuel prices didn't end up going as high as energy traders initially suggested they would. Some suggested that energy traders really just didn't know what they were talking about the sort of about the consequences of the Strait of Hormuz, and that's made things more difficult. But there are real problems coming down the track. Fertilizer is going to cause problems for food in particular. But what path you believe the global economy and domestic pressure is going to go along depends on really a guess, a punt, whether or not you think that the sort of it's less bad than expected for temporary or for permanent reasons. And nobody's got a really good argument either way. But I was told we just don't know, and that's why it's so hard at the moment. But nevertheless, there is a fear that quite bad things are coming down the track. So they're having to plan for something.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a big push, I think, in diplomacy on the formal tracks, and should we say the less formal tracks, through intelligence gathering to kind of basically get as much information about the Gulf states and whether they will, in the end, so there's a big push by about three of the major Gulf states and Saudi Arabia also there to constrain Donald Trump and to try to push towards a deal, and whether that if that would be a benign outcome for the UK. Another global actor, President Xi, weighing in overnight as he meets Vladimir Putin, which is never a promising duo. He's been saying that war in Iran has to end with the utmost urgency. And that does go to show that it is quite bleak. But the terms of that, and whether that benefits the democracies or the autocracies doing their own stitch-up deals, that is less less certain.
So let's look at the consequences one by one. And let's start with that supermarket prices story. Rachel Reeves has written in the Times that her priority is to keep prices down for households, and she'll look at all responsible options. And before we dive into the detail, Anne, I was just quite struck that's quite similar to language that Andy Burnham used about the cost of living earlier in the week in one of his many sets of comments. It just struck me slightly that there was an interesting alignment there. And I read somewhere, I was reminded, and I double checked this, because Rachel Reeves backed Andy Burnham in 2015 for his leadership bid back then. Interesting, after Chuka Ramuna withdrew. So there is a bit of back history between Burnham and Reeves. Anyway, let's get back to policy and away from scuttlebutt. The whole issue of what's going on with supermarkets and what the government's trying to negotiate burst onto the scene when the FT's Ashley Armstrong broke the news that there was a sort of negotiation about whether or not they can push supermarkets towards some kind of voluntary cap on food in return for some lower regulation. This is in the context that the newly elected fifth-term SNP government have got some legally enforced price caps coming down the track in response to what's going on in Iran. So Treasury very keen, I think, to draw the distinction and say this isn't legally enforceable. But if it's not that, and what is it?
Well, it seems that the Treasury is discussing a policy of voluntary price freezes rather than introducing caps, which would obviously be the most straightforward way to potentially lower prices. But unlike the plans that were drawn up by the SNP, this would also be voluntary. But I think we're talking about voluntary with a degree of inverted commas around that, because what's under discussion here is that retailers would be offered the easing of some regulations in exchange for freezing their prices on core goods. So it's a sort of a nudge, but a pretty hefty nudge to control prices. And it certainly is radical. A supermarket industry source telling the Times, if the government is trying to pursue a growth agenda, it seems extraordinary that they could be trying to control what businesses like ours are charging. The cost of regulation is enormous. So it doesn't sound like this is going to be announced in tomorrow's update on help vis-a-vis the Iran crisis, but it does sound like it's a live issue, Sam, and it sounds like you've been ferreting around on the shelves and finding out if there really is anything that can be done then in terms of pulling a policy lever.
So it's interesting there that the tendency of the Treasury when it comes to food prices is quite interventionist. Rachel Reeves has a big speech today, however, on growth, and that is going to be bad news for NIMBYs, because she's kicking off a really rather interesting, dare I say it, almost aggressive argument on supply side reform. If she gets her way, basically, she is going to make the case today that the government wants to end and curb the right to judicially review all sorts of clean energy and big infrastructure projects in order to get Britain building. This plan is big, it's controversial, and given the unstable political backdrop, it's actually really, really interesting. The headline proposal, which is all about getting Britain building again and faster, particularly in the energy sector, would be to allow Parliament to designate and approve the most important clean energy projects as what will be called critical national importance, CNI. And if they get that, they basically are no longer exposed to judicial review on anything but human rights grounds, which massively curbs your ability to challenge these projects. So this would protect, the government hope, Rachel Reeves hopes, new power stations, offshore wind farms from years of judicial review. And then there's a second category of infrastructure, so transport and water projects, where there would be basically a fixed legal challenge window at the end of which planning consent could be updated to address legitimate issues, but essentially that would be the end of the process. The law would have to be changed so that courts would refuse permission for the judicial review to proceed on any issues not brought up during that window, meaning that then developers basically just get on with it with full confidence that they won't have successive spurious challenges that can be raised at a later stage.
It does sound bold, and the question is, can it be done? And also, just to put in a word for NIMBYs is such a sort of sweeping category, but judicial review is something that is deemed a bit of a last resort for communities when they really believe that a national project is not in their local interest, that it's been bulldozed through, quite literally, in many cases. I'm thinking of things like the Kent building plan and the absolute, pushback that gets from large groups of people, right? So I think there will be here quite a big argument that you're right, Sam, that Rachel Reeves is going to engage. She's clearly decided that she does want to send this very strong signal that the critical national importance of infrastructure projects trumps these concerns. But if you are the opposition, and if you're the Conservatives or Reform, and you're in a particular county or part of the country where there is a lot of pushback, this I think is going to be a red rag to a bull on that, and I think we will see quite a lot of protest about eroding the rights to judicial review.
Oh, 100%. This is why this announcement is so eye-catching, because precisely for the reason I think that MPs and peers are going to find potentially objections to it. And at this moment, where clearly the Prime Minister's writ over his party is not exactly strong, I think it's a bold thing. So I did push on exactly this point. Do you have the political strength to do it? This government, the Starmer government, had already tried to rebalance the issue of judicial review, and they discovered it was very hard, and there were loads of objections, not least in the Lords, and there was a sort of very delicately constructed compromise through the planning and infrastructure bill that was passed earlier this year. So we've had a bite at the cherry at this, and now Rachel Reeves wants to come back for more. But I'm told that her view is, well, let's just have the argument, right? This is the moment to rise to solve a big problem. She thinks she spots a consensus in the Labour Party, at least, because the Growth Group kind of like this stuff and announced something similar last week to do all of this. And now is not a reason. Iran is not a reason to shy away from it. There is no imminent vote. It sounds like this proposal will be in the sexily called nuclear regulation bill, which we haven't seen of yet. And, ultimately, I think what's going on is we're not going to get that legislation, or certainly the crunch vote, happening this side of the summer. So if I'm being honest, Anne, I don't think this is going to come to a head when Keir Starmer potentially is in number 10. But what Rachel Reeves is doing is saying we still need to have a big conversation about the future of the country, and I'm going to do it come what may. And then it will all fall to what a sort of hypothetical Burnham premiership thinks about things like this, and how tough he's prepared to be on his MPs. By the way, Burnham pretty pro-growth, judging by a lot of what's gone on in Manchester. But I think what Rachel Reeves is really doing is taking a stand against political paralysis, which frankly is interesting and shows a bit more of a spark than we're getting from other bits of our political system.
I agree with that, and I think also you just you said it happened in a previous Netflix series about this government. It's interesting that Rachel Reeves and Andy Burnham had an alliance back in 2015, and where that might go if indeed we find ourselves in the Burnham era. But overall, I think this story is so interesting, Sam, because it's a good example of the kind of tangled knitting that the government is trying to sort of undo in order to get on with delivering, and the kind of delivery, in this case, big infrastructure and building, that moves the dial. So it's coincidental, but I also had a bit of a story on that, talking to officials this week about the delivery agenda, what's going on behind the scenes on that score. We had Darren Jones announcing that each department of government would have its own delivery unit, where that is relevant and you can track it. And one very senior civil servant telling me that while this focus on outcomes is good, there is still quite a lot of concern that there's two very different directions here. So bear with me for a moment. One is that you've got this push to break down silos between departments. And when it comes to projects that have to share budgets or capacity, there isn't really a very easy road to doing that in the UK system. And I think some officials at the high level are not convinced that these individual delivery SARs are the answer to that. Something else that has been happening very quietly in the last weeks is watering down the actual number of major projects in what's called the government major projects portfolio, from over 200 to well under 100. All of these are handled in the end.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is genuinely
Wow.
it's quite a big deal. If you can, I just recommend that you read things called Construction Weekly or whatever for more details on that. But these are all handled in the end by the Treasury, and the logic is that slashing the number of projects under central control helps focus. I guess that fits a bit with the sort of story that you were bringing us there about Rachel Reeves. Now, what you end up with then is more focus from this government on hard infrastructure, things like the Thames crossing, new hospitals, sort of Bob the Builder kind of projects. But there are some worries that what has been taken out of this kind of big central portfolio is stuff like technological upgrades, which are also seen as quite kind of high risk programs, and they will be managed now by government departments and local authorities in many cases, which arguably weakens scrutiny and arguably, but there's not a brilliant, should we say, history of these things being handled terribly well once they're pushed down to the local level. And it just goes against the direction that was set last year. And I'm sorry, this does contain acronyms, when the whole National Infrastructure Transformation and Services Authority, NISTA, was set up and pushed precisely to deal with a lack of clear strategic direction. So I think watch this space on that, because it sounds, as I say, it's a lot of acronyms, but it is also really about who is supposed to be driving what. I think there's still quite a bit of muddle on that.
Well, I think that's really quite something. In effect, that potentially means that when Keir Starmer and maybe Rachel Reeves as well stood up in the first 18 months, 24 months of their time in office and announced and promised communities particular projects would be delivered by this Labour government, now there is some sign in Whitehall that they're giving up on exactly some of those projects because it's all just been too hard to prioritise it. That's the consequence of reducing from 213 to under 100 the number of projects in the government's major projects portfolio. The moment Whitehall sniffs something going on a back burner, and it's not getting the kind of 360 support that these really complex projects need, it doesn't happen.
Also, by the way, they don't get as much scrutiny. There's a whole, the really big ones are supposed to get quite a lot of scrutiny and accountability, and that's supposed to drive them on faster. Well, let's see what happens. But I think we'll be coming back to this.
Right. Let's just go back to raw politics for a moment. Yesterday it was confirmed that there are now 3 by-elections coming up, 2 in Scotland, because 2 MPs have now become MSPs, and of course Makerfield, that could determine the future of the country. Reform UK unveiled their candidate in Makerfield. Interesting, not at an event where the media could ask questions, unlike Gorton and Denton, but in a video. What do we know about the individual and who is fighting for reform?
So facing Andy Burnham will be Robert Kenyon, 41-year-old, whose opening video, another slick video affair, a bit like the in the style of the Andy Burnham one, a lot about his life story, and a lot being made of the fact that he is a plumber. It is that different emphasis. Go local. I was already here. Andy Burnham is sort of trying to stride into town, but I am made in Makerfield after that experiment with Matt Goodwin that didn't work out. That go local is clearly the strategy here. He's already a councillor in the area and something of a name. So I think they're really doubling down on that. Expect more digital video and lots about plumbing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can get the names of all of the candidates in the show notes of this podcast as we come on, as the by-election draws close. I'm just going to end with a note of complication that may explain something that mystifies some of our listeners, because there's an issue with by-elections and the TV and radio coverage, bluntly. Because from the moment that the writ is moved, i.e. the by-election is formally called, coverage has to look different on TV and radio. It's because we're in a slightly odd world where there is heightened regulation just on TV and radio. And under Ofcom rules, broadcasters, but not, of course, people who just post on the internet, must give, in the legal language, due weight to parties and candidates during the campaign, and not interview a candidate or give a candidate an opportunity to make constituency points or promote their candidacy without offering the same opportunities to the other parties with strong evidence of electoral support. And, this really, bluntly messes with our heads, Anne, as broadcasters during election time, because it means you basically have to sit there, not quite with a stopwatch, but it means you get either TV pieces with 30 seconds from every candidate, or just lots and lots of vox pops and no candidates appearing. Today, there is a report by Cardiff University basically saying the rules around broadcasters' approach to by-elections and elections is a nonsense because it just inhibits proper scrutiny of policy, and just you end up doing endless vox pops because one candidate doesn't agree to appear, or there's just not enough time to do it like that. We're in a bit of a Alice in Wonderland world where those rules don't apply to most of the content on the internet. It's a bit of a niche point, but it will explain why actually election coverage can look quite odd. Not sure there aren't lots and lots of people who want to change it. Not that I think it will happen anytime soon.
I'm hoping we can still find things to talk about on the Bakerfield by-election after all of that.
We certainly will. Right, we will see you after PMQs back tomorrow for Thursday's Politics at Sam and Anne's.
See you tomorrow.
Thumbtack presents Tile Trouble. Every single time I use my sink, I make eye contact with the uneven grout on my kitchen backsplash. The crooked corners eye me, and I'm haunted by more tiling questions than I thought possible. What kind of pro can fix a backsplash? Can I replace one cracked tile, or should I replace them all? What if I just use Thumbtack? I can hire top-rated pros, read reviews, and compare prices with a tap, all on the app. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.